9th January 2017. Seeking the New Poetry. Today we look at a wonderful poet who had a deep occult understanding, Arjava. For me, Arjava's poems have always held deep inner treasures of the occult worlds that he was privy to when bringing down poetry of elegance and splendor. Many years ago, I went to the ashram library and met Debaranjan, who has guided and built it into one of the finest libraries in India. When I asked him if he had any books of Arjava's poetry, he said, "Let me see." To my everlasting gratitude, he brought out an extra copy of poems by Arjava, J.A. Chadwick, and presented it to me. How often I have read through the book and felt the closeness to this mathematician who had become a poet through Sri Aurobindo's guidance and largesse. J.A. Chadwick was born in 1899. Nothing much is known about his parentage or early years. He was educated at Cambridge in mathematical philosophy, where he was a, quote, distinguished don. As a professor of philosophy, mathematical logic, and a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, he was looked upon with extreme reverence for his stupendous abilities in mathematical philosophy, quote, of the specifically Cambridge sort. While at Cambridge, he had joined one of the groups of the Rosicrucians, and under the influence, Rosicrucianism made him face serious difficulties years later when he started practicing the integral yoga. Despite having a brilliant academic career, Chadwick's heart yearned for something else. A profound spiritual aspiration made him seek the truth, quote, that beyonded all formal and conceptual knowledge, end quote, of both mathematics and philosophy. He was also sick of the European civilization and felt depressed about the regrettable state the world was in due to the bankruptcy of spiritual wisdom. It was the fire of aspiration for the truth which compelled him to leave his family, friends, and home country and come to India in the 1920s. Chadwick joined Lucknow University as a lecturer in philosophy. There he befriended Ronald Nixon, the professor of English, who later became well known as Yogi Krishna Prem, and Durjati Prasad Mukherjee, the professor of economy and social science. The latter could not have helped Chadwick in his spiritual quest, as he himself was a staunch atheist. But it was Krishna Prem who introduced him to the writings of Sri Aurobindo. In 1928, Krishna Prem gave up his lectureship at Lucknow University and went first to Benares with his guru, Yashoda Ma, and later to Almora, where Yashoda Ma had built a temple retreat. His penultimate meeting with Chadwick took place at Benares, where they sat together on the banks of the Ganges and talked far into the night of dreams that lay close to our hearts, dreams that had brought us together as they had brought us both to India. Krishna Prem. They would meet again in a university bungalow at Lucknow. That was the last time they saw each other. In the meantime, Chadwick had decided to resign from his job as a professor in Lucknow University because, in his own words, "I came here to learn, not to teach." Moreover, he was, quote, tired of India's groves of academe, end quote. He had also made up his mind of going back to England when he decided to visit Pondicherry. Durjati Prasad gave him a letter of introduction addressed to Dilip Kumar Roy, who was his friend since long. In 1930, Chadwick arrived at Pondicherry and met Dilip Kumar, who later wrote about him, quote, "There was something striking in his face, which drew me at once to him," end quote. He told Dilip Kumar that though he had purchased some books of Sri Aurobindo, but he had not yet read them. And then he said that it was not books that he was athirst for. He craved something more, quote, concrete and living, end quote. And he added, quote, "I didn't come here to stay where I am, for I came here to win a passport, if I could, to your time-old wisdom of the Spirit, and that as a seeker, not as a critic," end quote. Dilip Kumar was deeply impressed by Chadwick's thirst for light, and, quote, "the note of transcendent sincerity in his delicately cadenced voice and strikingly intellectual physiognomy," end quote. He went to the mother and sought and received an appointment from her for Chadwick. The following day, Chadwick was taken to the mother by Dilip Kumar. The mother asked Chadwick why he was seeking spiritual wisdom, to which he replied that he sought so as he found life to be void of meaning, and only, quote, spiritual wisdom can fill the void, end quote. So with the purpose of attaining that wisdom, he had come to India, but in vain. The mother replied, "One receives in the measure of one's receptivity." Chadwick asked, "How is one to grow in receptivity?" The mother answered, "By sincerity and trust. Sincerity in one's seeking and trust in the divine grace. Sincerity you have, only you must learn to accept that you can get the response you want in proportion to your trust in grace." Chadwick left Pondicherry on that very day in the evening. He told Dilip Kumar, who had gone to see him off at the railway station, about the mother, that he had, quote, never been so overwhelmed by anyone, end quote. Though he left, his mind remained in Pondicherry. He realized that Pondicherry was the place where he would get the light and wisdom he aspired for. He wrote to Dilip Kumar after a few months and asked whether the mother would accept him as a disciple. The mother accepted him, and Chadwick came to India, leaving England forever, and joined the ashram. He was then 31 years of age. A new life began for him, who was one of the earliest sadhaks from the West to join the ashram. To mark the beginning of his new life, Sri Aurobindo gave him a new name, Arjavananda, Arjava in brief, which meant the joy of simplicity and straightforwardness in Sanskrit. I read now a foreword to Arjava's book of poems from Sri Krishna Prem. It must be now 12 years since Chadwick and I sat together on the banks of the Ganges at Benares, talking far into the night of dreams that lay close to our hearts, dreams that had brought us together as they had brought us to Indu. Of his past, I knew little, save that it included a fellowship at, I think, Trinity College, Cambridge, and that a distinguished Cambridge philosopher entertained great hopes from his brilliant abilities in mathematical philosophy of the specifically Cambridge sort. Somewhere between the chinks of his academic career, I surmised an initiation into the Kabbalistic tradition, and there was that in his eyes which showed unmistakably that it was not for the sake of a professorship in a provincial university that he had left his friends at Cambridge and crossed the 7 seas. Once more we met in a university bungalow at Lucknow, a background I think we both felt to be an utter irrelevance, and then we departed, I to the north, and he to the south, where he had found his guru in Sri Aurobindo. There in the ashram at Pondicherry, he lived for the last 10 years, shedding at the feet of his guru the burden of all that the world counts valuable, in order to find the hidden treasure for which most men have no eyes. Of his life and sadhana there, under the name Arjava, it is not for me to speak. That it brought about a profound psychic transformation in his nature is clear from the fact that he, whose language had hitherto been limited to the arid propositions of intellectual philosophy, became a poet, and with the aid of poetry, entered the inner worlds of which, till then, he had but dreamed. Traditionalists and those who take a narrow view of sadhana will perhaps wonder what poetry has to do with yoga. The truth is that the reintegration of the psyche that is brought about by sadhana has the effect of releasing unsuspected powers that were lying latent in the heart of the sadhaka, as indeed they are in the hearts of all. We read in books of yoga that by meditating on her who shines in the root lotus with the luster of 10 million suns, a man becomes lord of speech and pure of heart, by his deep and musical words, serves the greatest of the gods. The truth of such words, nowadays too often assumed to be mere empty praise, is witnessed to by these poems left behind by Arjava when, at what seems to us the early age of 40, the sovereign dweller of his heart decided to withdraw to inner worlds. The mere literary critic will admire the delicate, dreamlike beauty of these poems, but unless his insight is more than merely literary, he will go no deeper. For they deal with the mysteries of the inner life, and only he who can read their symbols will be able to penetrate to their heart. For Arjava, as is shown in the poem entitled Correspondences, nature was a shrine, in which each form seen in the flickering firelight of the senses was a shadow of realities that lay within, shining in the magical light of the secret moon, which was the master light of all his seeing, the central image of so many of his poems. In the midst of our personal sadness at his early departure, let us remember that this path is one which leads through many worlds, and that, as Sri Krishna said, Nahabikrama nasasti, for him who treads it, there can be no loss of effort. Sri Krishna Prem, July 6, 1939. Though Arjava's poetry requires one to go deeply within, or to try and enter or envision the worlds he describes, I feel the best approach is to first read. Here is Sri Aurobindo's comment on the poem Totalitarian. Night was closing on the traveler when he came to the empty, eerie courtyard with no name. Loud he called, no echo answered, nothing stirred, but a crescent moon swung wanly, white as curd, when he flashed his single sword blade through the gloom. None resisted, till he, frantic, filled with doom, hurled his weapon through the gloaming, took no aim, saw his likenesses around him do the same, viewed 1,000 swordless figures like his own, then first knew in that cold starlight hell alone. Sri Aurobindo. Exceedingly original and vivid, the description, with its economy and felicity of phrase, is very telling. 11th October, 1936. Question asked to Sri Aurobindo. My appreciation of the effect of Arjava's poem, especially its first 8 lines, was a little staled by the memory of Delamere's listeners. Sri Aurobindo. Delamere's poem has a delicate beauty throughout, and a sort of daintily fanciful suggestion of the occult world. I do not know if there is anything more. The weakness of it is that it reads like a thing imagined. The images and details are those that might be written of a haunted house on earth which has got possessed by some occult presences. Arjava must no doubt have taken his starting point from a reminiscence of this poem, but there is nothing else in common with Delamere. His poem is an extraordinarily energetic and powerful vision of an occult world, and every phrase is intimately evocative of the beyond as a thing vividly seen and strongly lived. It is not on earth, this courtyard and this crescent moon. We are at once in an unearthly world, and in a place somewhere in the soul of man, and all the details sparing with a powerful economy of phrase and image and brevity of movement, but revelatory in each touch, as opposed to the dim moonlight suggestiveness supported by a profusion of detail and long elaborating development in Delamere. Of course, that has its value also, makes us entirely feel ourselves there. I therefore maintain my description original, not only for the latter part of the poem, but for the opening also. It is not an echo, it is an independent creation. Indeed, the difference of the two poems comes out most strongly in these very lines. The faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall, the dark turf, 'neath the starred and leafy sky, are a description of things on earth, made occult only by the presence of the phantom listeners. But the empty courtyard with no name, or the crescent moon swung wanly, white as curd, are not earthly. They belong to a terrible elsewhere, while the latter part of the poem carries this elsewhere into a province of the soul. That is the distinction, and makes the perfect successfulness of Arjava's poem. 13th October, 1936.